Hello YouTubers out there, this is Jerry Saravia at the movies. So today we're talking about Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, released in May of 1984, and easily the most controversial of the four Indiana Jones flicks. And speaking as a critic, and as well as a super Indiana Jones fan, particularly of the movies, I thought it was appropriate, considering it's 40 years since Raiders, to discuss each one of these films. And it was suggested to me as well that this would be a good idea. Now, I've written certainly about all four of these films. In fact, Crystal Skull, I did a full-scale analysis on my blog. This is an attempt to delve a little bit deeper into what makes each one of these films stand out from the norm, that is to say, the action-adventure genre. So let's see what happened here. Temple of Doom was originally called Indiana Jones and the Temple of Death. They also, George Lucas, the creator of the character, and director Steven Spielberg, decided to not bring back Karen Allen as Marion. So they opted for a different female lead, which they did, and they set the film 1 year prior to the events of Raiders of the Lost Ark. So Raiders, as many of you know, was set in 1936, Temple of Doom in 1935. And they brought in Kate Capshaw as Willie Scott, this world-famous singer. And Indiana Jones runs into her when they're in Shanghai. So already there was going to be a different set of rules with regards to this picture. They didn't want to repeat Raiders. So they did an entirely different story and a far darker tone, a little more ominous, whereas the third film, Last Crusade, was a little more lighthearted, and Crystal Skull was somewhat lighthearted, to say the least, but there is something sinister about Crystal Skull, but we will discuss that later. So, back to Temple of Doom. The deal was that Lucas and Spielberg had a 3-picture deal. Initially, I think they were opting to do a 5-picture deal. And they went with a 3-picture deal through Paramount Pictures as the distributor, and also the one that coughed up the money to make these films. And of course they bring back Harrison Ford. Now, for me personally, this film is the most non-stop, breakneck action picture I've ever seen. Raiders certainly had its series of cliffhangers, but this movie went above and beyond that. It's not to say that every second has action. It's not true. It does break down a little bit in the middle for story purposes, to introduce us to the Kali worshippers, the Thuggee cult, that is, since the film is set in India. And again, we're not dealing with Nazis here. This is the Thuggee cult, something which has appeared in a film that clearly they were trying to ape, Gunga Din from 1939, which not only has a Thuggee cult, but the character that you see, played by Amrish Puri as Malaram in Temple of Doom, is a throwback to a character played by Eduardo Cernelli, who plays the Guru in Gunga Din. And if you look at the picture of him, he looks very much like Amrish Puri's Malaram. Even though that was an Italian actor playing in brown skin, playing a Indian character, and nowadays you would say South Asian. At least Amrish Puri was actually the real deal, playing Malaram. So, now, leaving aside the story and everything else, and the sense that the film is relentless in its action, I mean, for action fanatics out there, or fans of really heavy action type movies, particularly from that period, Temple of Doom fits the bill. No question about it. It was not, as Spielberg said, his intent to do Temple of Roses. This was going to be a darker picture. Supposedly George Lucas wanted to make it darker because he had just been through a divorce. Don't know what that has to do with anything regarding Indiana Jones, but this is what he said. So now there are some interesting facts behind Temple of Doom's release. When the film was released in theaters, almost immediately there was an outcry from parents who were taking their kids to see this picture, which includes moments that no kid really should be privy to. That is to say, a beating heart being taken out of a guy's chest. You don't even see that in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And the last film I know of to show somebody having their heart ripped out of their chest was the last Rambo movie. So this was extreme, to say the least. The gore in the film and the grimmer display of tricks led to an outcry, and parents were quite upset, including my own father, who, at the time I was at, I think, 12, 13 years old seeing the movie, but my brother was only 4, 5 years old, so this movie was a little too intense for him, to say the least. Kids screaming, it was completely haywire. So this film and Gremlins led to a new rating, which is the PG-13 rating. And that is to say, anything with too much intensity, particularly for what is an action-adventure film for all ages to some degree, this rating would befit that. Both films are very dark, Temple of Doom, Gremlins, but they led to this rating. But there were some other issues that Temple of Doom also had at the time. Now again, this was in 1984, so many scoffed, including people from India, at the racist stereotypes. Mostly, I think the real issue was the fact that the dinner table sequence at the Pankot Palace, so eating monkey brains and eyeball soup, these are not necessarily their normal delicacies. So it was seen as a little racist, to say the least, which fits in with Gunga Din, which was seen as quite racist at the time, 1939. So those were some of the issues. This was long before there was this woke sensibility that we have today. And what I found fascinating is that during the pandemic, when they had the Sunday night at the movies, they showed Raiders and they showed Last Crusade, but no Temple of Doom. So I think this film is considered too horrific for most. It's too much, overbearing for some people. I would even venture to guess that the characters of Willie Scott and Short Round, by the way, was based on a character named Short Round from a film called The Steel Helmet by Sam Fuller back in the day. And that was a Korean kid named Short Round. And, no doubt in my mind, it's also a hark back to Ronald Reagan in a film called Hong Kong from 1952, which featured a Chinese kid who looked and sounded a bit like Short Round, even though the character's name is different. But Reagan was dressed up in, the leather jacket and fedora, everything that we associate with Indiana Jones. So, but more likely the steel helmet. But anyway, the two characters were seen as annoying and a little cumbersome, and I don't completely disagree with that. However, the film to me is intense. It's it's an edge-of-your-seat action-adventure picture with horrific elements. But what I appreciate about the film, despite some of the racism, is how different it is from Raiders. And that's what I really appreciated. Last Crusade was a way of going back to what made Raiders loved by many, whereas Temple of Doom is not loved by many. In many ways, you could say Temple of Doom at the time was considered the Crystal Skull of the, at least of the initial 3 movies, the trilogy. Whereas now, I think Crystal Skull is hated probably more by more indie fans than just about any one of the other films in the series. So those are some of the things, but I don't know if Temple of Doom has necessarily aged well for some people because of the fact that it contains some of this, the racist caricatures and so on and so forth. and again, a little too much like a horror movie, which there are many elements like that in there. I did like Mala Ram, the character, but he is not nearly as interesting, I guess you could say, as Paul Freeman playing Belloc in Raiders of the Lost Ark, which easily is the best villain in the entire series, not to mention his henchman Tut that we see in that picture. But this guy is, he means business, so it does fit the villain aspect. He's probably a little more one note to some degree than the previous villains in Raiders, but he's still an effective villain nonetheless. He is a threat, and we feel that threat. I don't know what else I could possibly say about Temple of Doom, except it's the one film in the series that doesn't show in the University. He's sort of in the middle of an adventure, as usual in the prologue, and then is caught in yet another adventure before he can even make it back home. So that was an interesting bit of business. Yeah, and the other thing is the nobility of the character, which was different. In Raiders, he is after certain artifacts, to be sure. But in Temple of Doom, he is more of, he barters. And we see that side of him, and he's searching for fortune and glory. And he realizes that the best thing he can do is to restore life back to the village and give the stone back, which is what he does. This falls in line with Crystal Skull, which has Indiana Jones returning the skull to its proper resting place, so to speak. So there is a symmetry between those two movies. And even in Last Crusade, he might at the last minute think the Holy Grail is worth keeping as an object for himself, or putting it in a museum, when in fact it will just look like an old cup, and he's reminded that it's just better to let it go. So that's a significant change for the character, which I did appreciate. A lot of the, it's interesting, a lot of the action-adventure pictures that Raiders and Temple of Doom mimic back from the 1940s and 50s, films like Valley of the Kings, or especially Secret of the Incas with Charlton Heston, is that there isn't really this sort of a moral purpose attached to it. And certainly not much of a nobility. Usually these guys, they retrieve their artifacts and they go back home, and that's that. Whereas here, it's a little more complicated, and I appreciate that about it. Again, Temple of Doom is not for everybody, that's for sure. It's not even for many indie fans, although I think it has gained more stature than it did initially. But most films do, if they are good, and this is, of course, now 37 years later. So it certainly stands out as the odd duck in the series to a certain extent, only because it is different than the first one. And there you go. Now, Steven Spielberg doesn't like the picture, and had to apologize, and actually literally apologize by making Last Crusade. That was his apology, making it a little safer and not too horrific for most audiences, and bringing back a safe villain, that is to say the Nazis, which most people hate anyway. So, but that's rather unfortunate that he felt that way, I think, because the character of Indiana Jones, the beauty of the character is that he goes to places all around the globe. So you're going to encounter all sorts of different ethnicities and people who are out for greed and so on and so forth, and that's the nature of the character. That's been the nature of some of the novels and the comic books. But for the movies, I think Spielberg just decided to keep it a little safe, and that's what he did with Last Crusade, which is a very good film anyway. I place that on a higher number than Temple of Doom. And that's all I got to say about that. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe to Jerry Saravia The Movies and send me any questions you have about Temple of Doom or anything related to this character, who I'm a huge fan of. And this is Jerry Saravia at The Movies, signing off.